Karoline Leavitt walked into her husband's luxury hotel, seeking a quiet night away from Washington's glare, only to be told her reservation didn't exist. The receptionist's smirk said it all. She didn't belong. Karoline stayed calm, her hand clutching a locket, while the crowd whispered they didn't know she was married to the hotel's CEO or that she held a title that echoed through the White House. Why would someone judge her so quickly? Before we dive into today's story, if you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming stories. You're also welcome to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Every piece of feedback is truly valuable in helping Crossfire Justice improve. Thank you so much for always being with us. And now, let's jump into this thrilling and unexpected story together. Karoline Leavitt pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Crown Vantage Hotel, the cool air of the lobby washing over her like a fleeting relief from the weight of Washington's relentless grind. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor, each step a quiet rebellion against the chaos she'd left behind. She'd booked a room here under the name Caroline Wilson, a simple alias to dodge the prying eyes that followed her as the White House press secretary. All she wanted was a night of peace, a chance to breathe without the world dissecting her every word. The lobby glittered with chandeliers and polished brass, a world of luxury that felt both familiar and distant. She approached the reception desk, her shoulders slumped from exhaustion, her simple black coat blending into the crowd of well-dressed guests. Behind the counter stood Avery, a young woman with sharp eyes and a badge that gleamed under the lights. Her smile was practiced, but it faltered as she took Caroline's ID. She glanced at it, then back at Karoline, her lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sorry. There's no reservation under Caroline Wilson," she said, her voice loud enough to carry across the lobby. "Maybe you meant the motel down the street." The words landed like a slap, their condescension sharp and deliberate. A few guests nearby turned, their eyes flickering with curiosity or amusement. Karoline felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame but from the sudden, jarring sense of being sized up and found wanting. She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "I have a confirmation email," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to the email with the Crown Vantage logo, the booking details clear as day. She turned the screen toward Avery, who barely glanced at it before waving a dismissive hand. "Our system doesn't show anything. These things happen when people book through third-party sites." The lie was smooth, but Karoline caught the flicker of something in Avery's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or something colder. The lobby hummed with whispers now, the weight of every stare pressing against her. She could feel the judgment in their glances, the assumption that she was out of place, a nobody who'd wandered into the wrong world. Caroline's jaw tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. She'd faced worse than this. Rooms full of reporters tearing her apart, politicians dismissing her with a wave. But this was different. This was personal, a small cruelty dressed up as a mistake. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, her fingers brushing against a small locket tucked inside, a gift from her husband, Nicholas. Its familiar weight grounded her, a reminder of who she was beyond this moment. "Could you check again?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Avery sighed, tapping lazily at her keyboard, her eyes never leaving Caroline's face. "Nope. Still nothing," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Maybe try calling whoever made the booking." The air in the lobby seemed to thicken, the chatter of guests fading into a low buzz. A bellhop polishing a railing nearby glanced up, his hands pausing as he watched the exchange. Karoline caught his eye for a moment, but he looked away, unwilling to get involved. She stood there, alone in the crowd, her heart pounding with a mix of frustration and something deeper, a quiet resolve that hadn't yet found its voice. Avery leaned back, crossing her arms, her smirk widening as if she'd won some unspoken game. But Karoline's steady gaze held something Avery couldn't quite read, a hint of strength that didn't need to shout. The whispers grew louder, and Karoline felt the weight of every eye on her, judging, waiting. She wasn't just a guest anymore, she was a puzzle, and Avery had no idea what piece she was missing. What did this receptionist not know about the woman standing before her? Karoline Leavitt stood rooted at the reception desk of the Crown Vantage Hotel, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of her phone, where the confirmation email glowed like a small beacon of truth. The lobby's grandeur, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the soft murmur of well-heeled guests felt like a stage where she'd been cast as an outsider. Avery's smug dismissal still echoed in her ears, each word a barb that pricked at her composure. Her chest tightened with a frustration she hadn't felt since her early days in Washington, when reporters mistook her youth for inexperience. But she didn't argue. Not yet. She'd learned long ago that shouting rarely opened doors. Instead, she kept her voice soft, almost too soft, as she said, "Could I speak to a manager? Please." The request was polite, but it carried a weight that made Avery pause. If only for a moment. Avery leaned back, her arms crossed, her badge catching the light as she shrugged. "They're busy. You'll have to wait." The words were casual, but the glint in her eyes suggested she enjoyed this small exercise of power. Karoline felt the sting of being dismissed, not just as a guest, but as someone who didn't belong in this world of polished surfaces and effortless wealth. She glanced around the lobby, where a few guests lingered, their faces a mix of indifference and mild curiosity. A woman in a fur-trimmed coat checked her watch. Uninterested, a man with a briefcase scrolled through his phone. Oblivious, but a bellhop, no older than 20, polishing a brass railing nearby, caught her eye. His hands slowed, his gaze flickering with something curiosity, perhaps, or unease. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. Karoline's hand slipped into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the small locket tucked inside. It was a gift from Nicholas, her husband, engraved with their initials K and N. The cool metal grounded her, a quiet reminder of who she was beyond this moment, beyond the alias Karoline Wilson. She wasn't just a tired woman at a hotel desk, she was Karoline Leavitt, a name that carried weight in rooms far more powerful than this one. But she didn't say it. She'd chosen the alias for a reason: to slip away from the spotlight, to find a moment of peace after weeks of navigating Washington's relentless storms. The locket, with its simple engraving, was a tether to the life she'd built with Nicholas, a life where she didn't have to prove herself every second. Holding it now, she felt a flicker of calm amidst the storm brewing inside her. The lobby buzzed with its own rhythm, guests checking in, suitcases rolling, the clink of glasses from the bar across the room. But no one stepped forward to help. Karoline stood alone, her calm exterior hiding the churn of emotions beneath. She could feel Avery watching her, waiting for her to crack, to raise her voice or storm off in defeat. But Karoline had faced worse than this. She'd stood before cameras, fielded questions meant to trip her up, and walked away with her head high. This was just another test, another moment where someone underestimated her. She met Avery's gaze, her eyes steady, and said, "I'll wait." Then, the words were simple, but they carried a quiet defiance, a promise that this wasn't over. Avery's smirk faltered, just for a second, as if she sensed something she couldn't quite place. She turned back to her computer, her fingers tapping with less confidence now. Karoline stood there, her posture straight, her hand still resting on the locket in her pocket. The bellhop glanced up again, his hands still on the railing, his expression unreadable. The lobby's chatter seemed to fade, the air growing heavy with anticipation. Karoline's calm was a shield, but it was also a signal. There was something about her, something in the way she carried herself, in the quiet certainty of her gaze that Avery had overlooked. She wasn't just another guest. She was someone with a story, a truth that hadn't yet been spoken. Why did she stand so still, as if she knew something the rest of the room didn't? The lobby of the Crown Vantage Hotel pulsed with a quiet energy, its chandeliers casting soft light across the marble floors where Karoline Leavitt stood, her back straight but her heart racing. The air felt heavier now, thickened by the growing crowd of guests who lingered near the reception desk, their whispers weaving a net of judgment around her. Avery, the receptionist, had lost the thin veneer of professionalism, her patience snapping like a brittle twig. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but we don't just lose reservations," she said, her voice sharp and loud enough to carry across the lobby. The words weren't just a dismissal, they were a challenge, a public declaration that Karoline didn't belong. A few guests murmured, some nodding in agreement with Avery's authority, their faces etched with the kind of certainty that comes from assuming the system is always right. Karoline's face flushed, not with shame, but with the slow burn of injustice, a feeling she knew too well from her years in Washington's unforgiving arenas. She'd faced rooms full of skeptics, people who saw her youth or her politics and decided she was less than she was. But this was different. This was a stranger, a receptionist, wielding her small slice of power like a weapon. Karoline's fingers tightened around her phone, the confirmation email still glowing on the screen, a silent testament to the truth. She took a breath, steadying herself, and said, "The booking was made through a private channel. Could you check the VIP list?" Her voice was calm, measured, but it carried a quiet force, the kind that comes from knowing you're right, even when no one else believes you. Avery scoffed, her laugh short and cutting. "Private, sure." The word dripped with insinuation, as if Karoline had claimed to be royalty. She leaned forward, her elbows on the counter, her eyes narrowing. "Maybe you're in the wrong place, Ms. Wilson." The emphasis on the alias was deliberate, a jab meant to humiliate. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of amusement and disapproval. A woman in a sleek blazer whispered to her companion, "She doesn't look like she belongs here." A man with a leather satchel shook his head, as if Karoline's persistence was an inconvenience. The weight of their stares pressed against her, each glance a reminder that she was alone in this moment, a woman misjudged and underestimated. But Karoline didn't flinch. She'd been here before, in rooms where her voice was drowned out, where her presence was questioned. She felt the familiar ache in her chest, not just for herself, but for every person who'd ever been dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's picture of worth. Her hand slipped into her pocket, brushing against the locket Nicholas had given her, its engraved initials a quiet anchor. She thought of him, of the life they'd built together, and the strength it took to stand firm when the world tried to push you down. She met Avery's gaze, her eyes narrowing, not with anger but with a resolve that felt like fire beneath her skin. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice low but clear, each word a step across the line Avery had drawn. The bellhop, who'd been polishing a brass railing nearby, was closer now, his hands pausing as he watched the exchange. His name tag read Sam, and his young face held a flicker of hesitation, as if he sensed the moment teetering on the edge of something bigger. He'd seen Avery's sharp tongue before, but this felt different. There was something about this guest, something in her steady gaze, that made him wonder. The crowd's attention shifted, their whispers fading into a tense hush. A woman with a smartphone hovered nearby, her camera subtly angled toward the desk. capturing every word. Karoline felt the air thicken, the moment swelling with possibility. Like a storm gathering strength, she stood there, her phone in one hand, her dignity in the other, and refused to back down. Avery leaned back, her smirk faltering for a fraction of a second, as if she'd caught a glimpse of something she couldn't quite place. She tapped her keyboard, but her movements were less confident now, her eyes darting between Karoline and the screen. The lobby seemed to hold its breath, the guests watching, waiting for the next move. Karoline's heart pounded, not with fear but with the certainty that this wasn't just about a room, it was about being seen, being heard, being counted. She felt the eyes of the crowd, the weight of their assumptions, but she also felt something else, the quiet power of knowing who she was, even if no one else did. The moment felt like it was about to crack open, and someone was watching closely now, ready to tip the scales. Who would break first? The lobby of the Crown Vantage Hotel seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Karoline Leavitt stood at the reception desk, her heart pounding but her face composed, a quiet strength radiating from her despite the crowd's murmurs and Avery's sharp words still ringing in her ears. The receptionist's latest jab, her insinuation that Karoline was in the wrong place, had cut deeper than she'd expected. Not because it was true, but because it echoed every time someone had looked at her and seen only what they wanted to see. Her fingers, still gripping her phone, trembled slightly, not from fear but from the effort of holding back the storm inside her. She'd had enough, not of Avery's arrogance, but of being invisible in a world that should have known better. She took a deep breath, the kind that steadies the soul, and raised her phone. Her thumb moved with purpose, dialing a number she knew by heart. The crowd's whispers faded as she pressed the phone to her ear, her voice steady and clear. "Nicholas, can you come to the lobby?" The words were simple, almost casual, but they carried a weight that shifted the room's atmosphere. Avery rolled her eyes, her smirk returning as she leaned across the counter. "Calling your lawyer now," she mocked, her tone loud enough to draw a few chuckles from the guests nearby. But the bellhop, Sam, who'd been hovering near the brass railing, froze, his eyes widened, his hands still clutching the polishing cloth. He knew that name, Nicholas Caron, the man who ran this hotel, whose name was whispered with reverence among the staff. Karoline didn't respond to Avery's taunt. She lowered her phone, her gaze fixed on the receptionist, not with anger but with a quiet certainty that made Avery's smirk falter. The lobby's chatter dimmed, replaced by the soft click of footsteps approaching from the far end of the room. Heads turned as Nicholas Caron strode through the crowd, his tailored suit and measured gait commanding attention without effort. He was younger than some might have expected, but his presence filled the space, his dark eyes scanning the scene with a calm intensity. The guests parted instinctively, their murmurs growing hushed. Avery's face changed, her confidence draining as she recognized him. She straightened, her hands fumbling at the counter, but it was too late to undo what she'd set in motion. Karoline stepped forward, her movements deliberate, and handed Nicholas her phone. The screen displayed the confirmation email, its header bearing the Crown Vantage logo and a note indicating it came from Nicholas's private account. "This is the booking," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. Nicholas's eyes flicked to the screen, then to Avery, his expression unreadable but piercing. The crowd leaned in, sensing a shift, their whispers now tinged with curiosity. A woman with a smartphone, who'd been filming discreetly, zoomed in, her lens catching the moment. Avery stammered, her voice higher than before. "This must be a glitch." The system didn't show anything, but Nicholas's gaze cut through her excuse like a blade. And for the first time, Avery looked small, her authority crumbling under the weight of his presence. Karoline stood beside her husband, her hand brushing against the locket in her pocket. Its familiar weight a reminder of the life they'd built together. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand respect. Nicholas's arrival was enough to make the truth begin to surface. The bellhop, Sam, shifted his weight, his eyes darting between Karoline and Nicholas, as if piecing together a puzzle. The guests, too, began to murmur, their assumptions unraveling. "Is she his wife?" A man in a navy blazer whispered to his companion. "She's not just anyone," another guest muttered, recognizing Karoline's face from news broadcasts. The realization spread like a ripple. This wasn't just a guest. This was Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, a woman whose name carried power in circles far beyond this lobby. Avery's hands trembled as she tapped at her keyboard. Her earlier bravado gone. "I'll check again," she mumbled, but her voice lacked conviction. Nicholas raised a hand, stopping her. "No need," he said, his tone calm but final. "I know what's in the system." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Karoline's identity, her connection to Nicholas, her place in this world. It was all starting to dawn on those around her. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their eyes now on Avery, who seemed to shrink under their scrutiny. Karoline felt the weight of their gazes shift, no longer judging her but questioning the woman behind the counter. She stood there, her heart still racing, but there was a new feeling now, a quiet resolve, a sense that the truth was closing in, and it wouldn't be silenced. How had Avery missed this? And what would happen when the full truth came to light? The lobby of the Crown Vantage Hotel felt like a stage caught in the hush before a storm breaks, its marble floors and glittering chandeliers framing a moment that had grown larger than anyone expected. Karoline Leavitt stood beside her husband, Nicholas Caron, her posture steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. The weight of Avery's earlier dismissal, the sting of being judged by strangers, still lingered, but something new was stirring now, a flicker of hope, fragile but growing. As the truth began to take shape, Nicholas held a tablet, his fingers moving with swift precision as he pulled up the hotel's booking system. The screen glowed with undeniable evidence: Karoline's reservation, intact and flagged as VIP, with her alias, Karoline Wilson, clearly listed. But it was the next detail that sent a ripple through the crowd, a log showing Avery's unauthorized deletion of the booking. Time-stamped just minutes ago. Gasps broke the silence, sharp and sudden, as the guests leaned closer, their eyes darting between the tablet and Avery's paling face. A woman in a red scarf, who'd been filming the exchange on her phone, zoomed in, her hands steady as the video streamed live to social media. Karoline felt the shift in the room, the crowd's attention no longer pressing against her but turning, like a tide, toward the receptionist who'd wielded her power so carelessly. Avery's voice trembled as she stumbled over her words. "It was an error. I didn't mean to delete anything, but the lie was thin, fraying under the weight of the evidence." Her hands fumbled at the counter, her earlier confidence replaced by a desperate need to explain herself. The crowd wasn't buying it, their murmurs growing sharper, tinged with disbelief and disapproval. Karoline stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, the locket in her pocket a quiet anchor against the chaos. She didn't need to shout or accuse, her presence was enough, her dignity a silent rebuke to Avery's actions. She looked at the crowd, their faces a mix of shock and dawning respect, and spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I just wanted a room, not a fight." The words landed gently, but they carried a weight that silenced the room. They weren't a plea or a defense. They were a statement of truth, a reminder that this moment hadn't been her choice, but she'd faced it anyway. The bellhop, Sam, who'd been watching from the sidelines, nodded, his young face etched with quiet respect. He'd seen plenty of guests come and go, but there was something about Karoline, her restraint, her refusal to lash out that made him stand a little straighter. Nicholas's gaze never left Avery, his tone ice-cold as he spoke. "You've made a choice. Now face the consequences." The words were measured, but they cut through the air like a verdict. Avery's shoulders slumped, her eyes darting to the crowd, searching for an ally but finding none. The woman in the red scarf lowered her phone for a moment, her expression softening as she looked at Karoline, as if seeing her for the first time. A man in a gray suit, who'd earlier nodded at Avery's authority, now shook his head, muttering to his companion, "That's not right." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some voices rising in support of Karoline's restraint, others questioning how Avery could have been so reckless. A few guests clapped, tentative at first, then stronger, their applause a small but growing wave of acknowledgement. Karoline felt the warmth of their support, but it wasn't triumph. She felt it was relief, tinged with the ache of having to prove herself in a place where she'd only wanted to rest. She glanced at Nicholas, his steady presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. His hand brushed against hers, a fleeting touch that spoke volumes. She thought of the locket, of the life they'd built together, and the countless times she'd faced moments like this not just in hotel lobbies, but in boardrooms, on live television, in the relentless churn of public life. Each time, she'd chosen to stand firm, not with anger but with the quiet power of truth. And now, that truth was reshaping the room around her. The woman with the phone raised it again, her video capturing every moment, the tablet's damning evidence, Avery's faltering excuses, Karoline's unwavering calm. Online, the clip was already spreading. Hashtags like Crown Vantage Scandal and Know Her Name gaining traction. Comments poured in, some praising Karoline's grace, others condemning Avery's bias. The lobby, unaware of the digital storm brewing, felt the weight of its own transformation. Sam, the bellhop, shifted his weight, his eyes lingering on Karoline with something like admiration. He'd been silent before, unsure of his place, but now he felt a pull to act, to say something, though he didn't yet know what. The crowd's energy was shifting, no longer a wall of judgment but a circle of witnesses, ready to see what came next. Karoline stood there, her heart still racing, but there was a new clarity in her mind. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or judged for reasons that had nothing to do with who they were. She felt the weight of that responsibility, but also the strength to carry it. The lobby buzzed with anticipation, the guests watching, waiting for the next move. Avery's hands trembled as she stared at the tablet, her world unraveling. Nicholas's calm authority held the room, but it was Karoline's quiet resolve that anchored it. Something bigger was brewing, not just in the lobby but beyond its walls, where the truth was finding its voice. What would this moment unleash when the world saw it? The lobby of the Crown Vantage Hotel had transformed into a quiet arena, its polished surfaces reflecting the tension that hung heavy in the air. Karoline Leavitt stood beside Nicholas Karen, her husband and the hotel's CEO, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the locket in her pocket a steadying presence. The crowd's murmurs had softened, but their eyes were sharp, fixed on Avery, whose earlier confidence now lay in tatters. The receptionist's face was pale, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as Nicholas's voice, calm but unyielding, cut through the silence. "I'm calling for the HR manager," he said, his words carrying the weight of a decision already made. Avery's eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking through her crumbling facade. The tablet on the counter still glowed with the damning evidence of her actions. Karoline's VIP reservation deleted out of spite, a choice that had unraveled in front of everyone. Avery's voice, once sharp with authority, now trembled as she tried to salvage her position. "It was a mistake. I didn't know who she was," but the lie faltered. and under the pressure of Nicholas's piercing gaze, her excuses unraveled. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a desperate mutter, as if speaking to herself. I recognized her from the news. She's one of them. The words slipped out, raw and unguarded, revealing the bias that had fueled her actions. A hush fell over the lobby, broken only by a few sharp gasps. Karoline's heart clenched, not from the sting of Avery's words, but from the realization that this wasn't just about a room. It was about a prejudice that had judged her before she'd even spoken. She remained composed, her eyes meeting Nicholas's with a quiet gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of his unwavering support. The crowd's mood shifted, like a tide turning against the shore. A woman in line, who'd earlier nodded at Avery's authority, now shook her head, her voice low as she whispered to her friend, "That's not right." The man beside her, clutching a leather satchel, looked away, his earlier certainty replaced by discomfort. The woman with the red scarf, still filming, lowered her phone for a moment, her expression torn between shock and sympathy. Karoline felt the change. The crowd no longer a wall of strangers, but a gathering of witnesses, their judgment now falling on Avery. She stood there, her posture steady, but inside, a storm of emotions churned: anger at the injustice, sorrow for the division that fueled it, and a quiet resolve to see this through, not for revenge, but for the truth. Then, a small movement caught her eye. Sam, the bellhop, stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the brass railing. His young face was pale, his hands twisting the polishing cloth as he spoke, his voice shaky but clear. "I saw her do it," he said, his eyes darting to Avery before settling on Nicholas. "I saw her delete the reservation. I didn't say anything because I was scared, but I can't stay quiet now." The confession landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Gasps turned to murmurs, and a few guests nodded, their respect for Sam's courage evident. Karoline looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude for this young man who'd chosen to speak when it wasn't easy. His words sealed Avery's fate, stripping away the last of her defenses. Avery's shoulders slumped, her hands falling limp at her sides. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, but her voice was drowned out by the crowd's growing discontent. Nicholas's expression remained impassive, but his voice was firm as he addressed her. "Your actions have consequences, and they start now." The HR manager, a woman in a crisp blazer, arrived, her face grim as she began speaking to Avery in low tones. The crowd watched, some shaking their heads, others whispering about fairness and accountability. Karoline stood silently, her eyes tracing the marble floor, her thoughts drifting to the countless times she'd faced moments like this, moments where she'd had to prove her worth, not just to others but to herself. Outside the lobby, the world was already reacting. The woman's video had spread across social media, hashtags like Justice at Crown Vantage and Know Her Name trending nationwide. Comments poured in, some praising Karoline's grace under pressure, others debating the deeper issues of bias and power. Karoline was unaware of the digital storm, but she felt the weight of the moment in the lobby, the sense that something larger was at play. She could have spoken, could have unleashed the anger she felt, but she chose silence not out of weakness, but because she knew the truth didn't need her to shout. Her silence spoke louder than any accusation, a quiet power that reshaped the room. Sam stood nearby, his shoulders squared now, as if his confession had lifted a burden. The crowd's murmurs grew softer, their attention split between Avery's unraveling and Karoline's unshakable calm. Nicholas placed a hand on Karoline's arm, a small gesture that grounded her in the chaos. She felt the locket in her pocket, its weight a reminder of the life she carried with her, a life built on resilience and love. The HR manager led Avery away, her head bowed, her career hanging by a thread. The lobby seemed to exhale, the tension easing but not dissipating. Karoline knew this wasn't the end. There was more to come, more to say, but for now, she stood firm, her silence a testament to the strength she'd always carried. What would she say when the moment called for her voice? The lobby of the Crown Vantage Hotel fell into a profound silence, the kind that follows a storm when the air feels cleansed but heavy with what's been left behind. Karoline Leavitt stood at the center of it all, her heart still racing from the confrontation, but her face calm, her eyes tracing the marble floor as if searching for something steady. The crowd, once a wall of whispers and judgment, now watched her with a mix of awe and respect, their earlier assumptions shattered by the truth. Nicholas Karen, her husband, stood beside her, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. His voice, firm but measured, broke the stillness as he addressed the room. Avery's employment is terminated, effective immediately. The words landed like a gavel, final and unyielding, and a ripple of murmurs spread through the guests, some nodding in approval, others exchanging glances of disbelief. Avery stood behind the counter, her shoulders slumping, her earlier defiance drained away. The sharp edge of her confidence was gone, replaced by a stunned realization that her actions had unraveled her world. Her hands, which had once tapped the keyboard with such certainty, now hung limp at her sides, and her eyes darted to the floor. Avoiding the crowd's gaze, Karoline watched her, not with satisfaction but with a quiet sorrow, not for Avery's fate, but for the choices that had led them both to this moment. She stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the marble, and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't come here to ruin you. I just wanted to rest." The words were simple, but they hit like a wave, carrying a truth so raw that a few guests wiped their eyes. Moved by the grace in her restraint, Nicholas placed a hand on Karoline's shoulder, his touch light but filled with pride. His eyes, usually so guarded, softened as he looked at her, a silent acknowledgement of the strength she'd shown. Karoline felt the warmth of his hand, a reminder that she wasn't alone, that this moment, painful as it was also a testament to the life they'd built together. She thought of the locket in her pocket, its engraved initials a symbol of their shared journey, and her fingers twitched, wanting to hold it. But before she could, Sam, the bellhop, stepped forward, his young face earnest as he held out his hand. "Ma'am, this fell earlier," he said, his voice steady now. Unlike the tremor it had held when he'd confessed Avery's actions, in his palm was the locket, its silver surface catching the chandelier's light. Karoline took it, her fingers brushing against his, and a tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. She clutched the locket, its familiar weight grounding her, and whispered, "Thank you." The gesture was small, but it carried a weight that Sam seemed to feel, his shoulders straightening as he nodded. The crowd watched, their silence deepening, as if they understood that this wasn't just about a lost trinket, it was about restoring something deeper, something that had been tarnished by Avery's actions. Karoline's tear wasn't weakness. It was the release of a tension she'd carried since she'd walked into the lobby, the ache of being unseen finally easing under the weight of truth. The guests began to part, creating a path toward the elevator, their movements slow and respectful. As if honoring Karoline's dignity, she took a step, then another, her head high, her steps measured. Nicholas walked beside her, his hand still on her shoulder, a quiet promise that he'd be there, no matter what came next. The woman in the red scarf, who'd filmed the entire exchange, lowered her phone, her eyes meeting Karoline's with a nod of respect. The man in the gray suit, who'd once sided with Avery, now looked away, his face flushed with shame. The lobby, once a place of judgment, had become a space of reckoning, where truth had reshaped the narrative. Outside, the world was catching fire with the story. The video, now viral, had sparked heated debates across social media, with thousands of comments dissecting workplace bias, power, and accountability. Hashtags like Justice at Crown Vantage trended, but one comment stood out, shared and liked thousands of times. She didn't fight with anger. She fought with truth. Karoline was unaware of the online storm, but she felt its echo in the lobby, in the way the crowd looked at her now, not as an outsider, but as someone who'd stood firm and won, not by shouting but by being. She reached the elevator, the doors sliding open with a soft chime, and paused, her hand tightening around the locket. This victory was hers, but it wasn't just about her. It was for every person who'd been dismissed, misjudged, or silenced by someone who thought they held the upper hand. Karoline felt the weight of that, the responsibility to carry this moment forward, not as a triumph over Avery, but as a reminder of what truth could do. She stepped into the elevator, Nicholas at her side, and the doors began to close. The crowd watched, their faces a mix of admiration and reflection, as if they, too, were grappling with what they'd witnessed. Karoline's tear had dried, but her heart was full of gratitude, of resolve, and of a quiet certainty that this wasn't the end of the story. What did this victory really mean for her? And for those who'd seen it unfold, Karoline Leavitt stepped into the quiet of her suite at the Crown Vantage Hotel, the door closing softly behind her, muffling the distant hum of the lobby that had been her battleground just moments ago. The room was a haven of muted golds and creams, its wide windows framing a glittering city skyline that stretched out like a promise of calm. She set her bag on a velvet chair, her movements slow, as if each one was a deliberate act of reclaiming herself. The weight of the day, its sharp words, its judging eyes, its hard-won victory pressed against her. But as she crossed to the window, she felt it begin to lift. The city lights twinkled, indifferent to her struggles, and in their vastness, she found a kind of peace, a reminder that some things were bigger than a single moment, no matter how heavy it felt. She slipped her hand into her pocket, pulling out the locket that had been her anchor through the storm. Its silver surface caught the soft glow of the room, and she opened it, her fingers tracing the engraved initials K and N. The locket was more than a gift from Nicholas. It was a piece of their story, a quiet vow that had carried her through countless trials. She let out a long breath, the tension in her shoulders easing, and sank into a plush armchair, the locket still in her hand. The memory of the lobby, of Avery's crumbling defiance and the crowd's shifting gaze played in her mind, but it felt distant now. Like a story she'd heard rather than lived. She'd stood firm, not with anger but with truth, and that truth had reshaped the world around her. Nicholas entered the suite, his footsteps soft on the carpet, his presence as steady as ever. He paused by the door, watching her with a tenderness that needed no words. "You didn't have to prove anything, but you did," he said, his voice low, carrying a pride that warmed her more than any applause could. He crossed to her, sitting on the arm of her chair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Karoline looked up at him, her eyes meeting his, and smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of peace, the kind that comes when you faced a storm and found yourself still standing. "I just wanted to be seen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not as someone important, but as me." They sat in silence for a moment, the city's glow filling the space between them. Karoline thought of the locket, of Sam's courage, of the crowd's changing faces. She thought of Avery, too, not with bitterness, but with a quiet hope that the lesson would linger, that it might change something in her. even if only a little. The world outside was moving on, but it was moving differently now. The hotel had issued a public apology, its statement posted online and sent to news outlets, promising mandatory bias training for staff and a review of hiring practices. Reporters had picked up the story, framing it as a lesson in humility, a reminder that power, no matter how small, could be wielded poorly if unchecked. Karoline hadn't sought the spotlight, but it had found her, and she felt the weight of that responsibility. She reached for her phone, curious about the ripples her stand had caused. Scrolling through social media, she found the video now viewed millions of times alongside hashtags like Justice at Crown Vantage and Know Her Name. The comments were a tapestry of voices. Some debated workplace bias. Others shared their own stories of being dismissed or judged. But what struck her most were the messages from strangers. Ordinary people who felt seen in her quiet strength. "Thank you for standing up," one wrote. "I've been where you were, and you gave me hope," said another. Karoline's throat tightened, not from sadness but from the realization that her moment, as personal as it had been, had touched others in ways she hadn't imagined. She set the phone down, her smile deepening, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection she'd forged without meaning to. The suite was still, save for the soft hum of the city beyond the window. Nicholas squeezed her shoulder, his presence a steady reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Karoline closed the locket, slipping it back into her pocket, and leaned back in the chair, her eyes on the skyline. The world kept turning, but something had shifted, not just in the hotel, not just in the digital storm, but in her. She'd come here seeking rest, but she'd found something more, a reminder of her own resilience, of the power of standing firm, of the way truth could echo when spoken softly. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She'd proven that in the lobby, and the world had listened. As she closed her eyes, one truth lingered, clear and unshakable sometimes. The loudest truths are the ones that don't need a voice, only someone brave enough to stand and let them echo. What would this truth mean for the days ahead? For her and for those who'd carry it forward? Karoline's locket gleamed faintly as she closed it. The city lights beyond her window, a quiet witness to her strength. There was no applause, just the soft hum of a world that had shifted, if only a little. Peace settled in her heart. Not loud, but deep. What does it mean to win, when the victory is simply being seen? Sometimes, the loudest truths don't need a voice, they just need someone to stand and let them breathe.